Imagine if you were born into a world where your mother spent $300,000 on a single party, not because she loved celebration, but because she was terrified of being forgotten. Where your inheritance was not measured in stocks or land, but in the number of footmen who announced your arrival at a ball. This was the inheritance of the Gilded Age socialite children, whose mothers waged war not with swords, but with orchids, not with armies, but with guest lists. Mrs. Eva Stotesbury, Alva Vanderbilt, Mamie Fish. These women turned social climbing into a blood sport, and the battlefield was paved with their husbands' fortunes. But every war has casualties, and in this war, the casualties were their own children. Chapter 1. When Roses Cost More Than Houses. In 1896, Mrs. Carolyn Aster spent $12,000 on flowers for a single evening, enough to buy 3 brownstones. The roses arrived at dawn, American beauties, shipped overnight from forced greenhouses in Pennsylvania. Orchids followed by noon. Rare cattleyas flown from South America in specially designed temperature-controlled crates. By evening, the Aster ballroom looked like a garden had conquered a palace. $12,000, gone before the first guest arrived. To understand what $12,000 meant in 1896, you need to leave the ballroom. Walk 6 blocks south from Mrs. Aster's 5th Avenue mansion, and you will find tenement apartments where entire families of 5 lived on $300 a year. The flowers cost 40 years of their labor, but Mrs. Aster was not decorating for tenement families. She was decorating for the only people who mattered in her world, the 400. The 400 was not a club you could join. It was a list. Mrs. Caroline Aster created it with surgical precision. 400 names. The exact number of people who could fit comfortably in her ballroom. If your name appeared on the list, you existed. If it did not, you were no one. It did not matter if you had $10 million. It did not matter if you owned railroads or steel mills. Without Mrs. Aster's approval, you were simply rich. With it, you were society. This was the world that created the war. Because artificial scarcity creates desperate hunger, and desperate hunger creates predators. Enter Eva Cromwell. Born to modest Philadelphia money, married once to a man with a respectable name and no fortune. Widowed young. Ambitious, always. She understood the mathematics of social climbing. You could not buy your way into the 400, but you could marry your way in. So she set her sights on Edward Stotesbury, partner at Drexel and Company, the Philadelphia arm of the J.P. Morgan banking empire. Edward was 62. Eva was 37. He had $40 million. She had a plan. Enter Alva Smith. Also born to modest money, though she would spend her life pretending otherwise. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore, heir to a railroad fortune so vast it made old money families look poor. Alva did not marry for love. She married for war, because she had been rejected by Mrs. Aster once, and she would spend the next 30 years making sure it never happened again. Enter Mamie Stuyvesant, born into old New York money that was more name than wealth. She married Stuyvesant Fish, a railroad magnate who gave her 2 things: his last name, which opened doors, and his checkbook, which she wielded like a sword. Mamie was different from Eva and Alva. She did not want to impress Mrs. Aster. She wanted to replace her. By 1896, the battle lines were drawn. Mrs. Aster sat at the top, spending $12,000 on flowers because she could, because no one had ever challenged her, because the throne seemed permanent. But 3 women were sharpening their knives. and the weapon they chose was money, not their own money, their husband's money. And they were about to discover that there is no amount too large when the prize is being remembered. The question that hung over Fifth Avenue was simple. What made being excluded more terrifying than being broke? The answer would take 30 years and $100 million to reveal. But on that night in 1896, surrounded by roses that cost more than houses, Mrs. Aster had no idea that her reign was ending. Because you cannot defend a throne when your challengers are willing to burn their kingdoms to take it. Chapter 2. The Women Who Married. Fortunes to Burn Them. Eva Cromwell did not love Edward Stotesbury when she married him. She loved what his banking empire could buy her, a crown. The wedding took place in 1912. Eva was 48. Edward was 73. The age gap did not matter. What mattered was that Edward sat on the board of U.S. Steel. What mattered was that his signature appeared on checks that funded railroads, financed wars, and floated government bonds. What mattered was that marrying Edward Stotesbury meant marrying into the same sphere as J.P. Morgan himself. The honeymoon lasted 3 weeks. The spending started on week 4. Ava's first demand was simple. She needed a house, not just any house. A house that would make Mrs. Aster's mansion look provincial. Edward bought her Whitemarsh Hall, 147 rooms spread across 300 acres in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. The house took 4 years to build. It cost $3 million. The annual maintenance cost another $200,000. Edward signed the checks without argument. Because he was 73 years old and his young wife was beautiful, and she said she needed this to be happy. But Ava was not alone in her strategy. Alva Vanderbilt had pioneered it 20 years earlier. Alva married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875. She was 22, he was 26. Unlike Eva, Alva did not marry an old man for convenience. She married a young heir for maximum extraction time. William's grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had died the richest man in America. His fortune, $100 million, was split among his children. William's share was $10 million. In 1875, $10 million was enough to fund a small nation. Alva spent it like a general waging a campaign. Her first target was Mrs. Aster, because Mrs. Aster had a rule. The Vanderbilts were not society. The Vanderbilts were trade. Railroads were commerce, and commerce was vulgar. It did not matter that Cornelius Vanderbilt had more money than every old money family combined. Mrs. Aster's ballroom was closed to them. Alva decided to break the door down. She commissioned Marble House, a 50-room summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. The ballroom alone cost $500,000. The walls were gold, not gold paint, gold leaf, 750,000 sheets of it, applied by hand. When Alva threw her housewarming ball in 1892, Mrs. Aster had a choice. Attend and acknowledge the Vanderbilts as equals, or stay home and admit that money could in fact buy entry. Mrs. Aster attended. Alva had won. But winning did not satisfy her, because once you break down one door, you realize there are others. And Alva was not interested in being accepted. She was interested in being dominant. Mamie Fish understood this instinctively. She married Stuyvesant Fish in 1876, and unlike Eva and Alva, Mamie did not pretend to love her husband. She called him Stuyvesant in public and barely spoke to him in private. What she loved was his position. Stuyvesant Fish ran the Illinois Central Railroad. His income was $500,000 a year. Mamie spent $600,000. The math did not concern her, because Mamie had discovered the secret that would define Gilded Age social warfare. Your husband's fortune was not a finite resource. It was a line of credit. And as long as you kept spending, he kept earning. And as long as he kept earning, you kept spending. The system only collapsed when one side stopped. And Mamie had no intention of stopping. These marriages were not love stories. They were arms deals. The women provided beauty, youth, and the appearance of domestic happiness. The men provided the ammunition, and the target was always the same. Other women, not their husbands' business rivals, not foreign powers. Other women who wanted the same thing they wanted, to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. Did these women ever see their husbands as anything other than walking checkbooks? The letters suggest they did not. Edward Stotesbury wrote to Eva constantly. Affectionate letters, worried letters, letters begging her to slow down the spending. Her replies were short, lists of things she needed, new furniture, new jewels, new invitations to send. She signed them, "Your devoted wife," but devotion was a currency she spent as carefully as everything else. William Vanderbilt tried to refuse Alva once. She threatened divorce, not because she wanted to leave, because she knew the scandal would humiliate him more than the cost of compliance. He never refused again. Stuyvesant Fish stopped arguing with Mamie entirely. He retreated to his office and signed checks and let his wife wage her war. By 1900, he had become a ghost in his own home. Present at parties because protocol required it, silent because speaking had proven useless. The transaction was complete. These men had built empires, and their wives were dismantling them, one ball at a time. But the men could not stop them. Because stopping meant admitting the marriage was a transaction, and admitting the transaction meant admitting they had been fools. So they kept signing, and their wives kept spending. And the only people who saw the truth were the children, watching from the corners of ballrooms, learning that love was a contract, and contracts could be broken when one side ran out of money. Chapter 3. The night they all declared war. On January 10th, 1903, Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball that cost $620,000, and the battlefield was set. The invitations arrived 6 weeks early. Heavy cardstock, gilded edges, hand-delivered by footmen in livery. The instructions were specific. Costumes were mandatory, not store-bought costumes. Historically accurate period dress, fabricated by European couturiers, approved by Alva herself. The theme was Versailles. The subtext was domination. Alva spent 4 months planning. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, to transform the ballroom into the Hall of Mirrors. $200,000 went to flowers. Orchids from Brazil, roses from France, lilies from Japan. 50,000 went to musicians. A full orchestra, a chamber quartet, and a jazz ensemble for the post-midnight hours. The food alone cost $75,000. Champagne from the private cellars of French nobility. Caviar shipped on ice from Russia. Desserts constructed by pastry chefs imported from Paris for the single evening. But the real cost was the costumes. Alva commissioned hers from Worth of Paris. A Venetian princess gown, 18th century design, sewn with real emeralds and diamonds. The dress cost $80,000. She wore it once. The guests tried to match her. Mrs. John Jacob Aster came as Marie Antoinette. Her wig alone cost $5,000, 3 pounds of human hair woven with silk ribbons and fresh flowers that had to be replaced every 2 hours. Mamie Fish arrived as Catherine the Great. Her costume included a $15,000 tiara, borrowed from a Russian duchess, and a cape lined with ermine, 100 pelts stitched together. The New York Times covered the ball like a military campaign. They published the guest list, the menu, the estimated costs. The editorial page called it obscene. Protestant ministers gave sermons condemning the excess. Working-class newspapers printed comparisons. The ball cost what a steel worker earned in 40 lifetimes, enough to feed 10,000 families for a year. Alva read the criticism and smiled, because the criticism meant they were talking about her, and being talked about was the point. But the ball had consequences Alva did not anticipate, because every other society woman read the same coverage, and they understood what had happened. Alva had reset the ceiling. $620,000 was now the baseline. If you wanted to matter, you had to match it. And if you wanted to dominate, you had to exceed it. Ava Stotesbury was still married to her first husband in 1903. She read about Alva's ball and made notes, extensive notes, cost breakdowns, guest lists, vendors. She filed them away for later, because Eva understood something crucial. Alva had money now, but money ran out. Edward Stotesbury's money would not run out in Eva's lifetime, which meant when the time came, Ava could outspend everyone. Mamie Fish read about the ball and felt rage, not because she disapproved, because she had not thrown it first. Mamie had been planning her own Versailles ball. Now anything she did would look like imitation, so she pivoted. If she could not be first, she would be strangest. Her next party featured a live bear as the guest of honor. The bear sat at the head table, ate from gold plates, and wore a $2,000 diamond collar. The newspapers called it absurd. Mamie called it marketing. By the end of 1903, the unspoken rules had changed. Mrs. Aster's $12,000 flower budget was quaint. Alva's $620,000 was the new standard, and every woman with access to a husband's fortune understood the assignment: outspend or be outshone. But wars need more than opening shots. They need sustained campaigns. And these women were willing to wage war for decades. Because they had discovered something about themselves. They were not spending money to impress their peers. They were spending money because they were addicted to being noticed. And, like all addictions, it required more and more to achieve the same high. The Bradley Martin Ball became the reference point. Every party after was measured against it. Did you spend more or less than Alva? If less, you had failed. If more, you had won. Until someone else spent more than you, and then you had to plan the next campaign. The children watched all of this. Louise Stotesbury was 12 in 1903. She watched her future stepmother take notes on Alva's ball. She did not understand then what those notes meant, but she would, because by the time Louise was 20, those notes would have consumed her inheritance, one ball at a time. The war had been declared. The combatants were locked in, and the only question remaining was how long the money would last. The answer, it turned out, was exactly as long as it took to destroy everything. Chapter 4. When your mother spends your inheritance before you turn 20. By 1907, Ava Stotesbury had burned through $4 million in party expenses, while her stepchildren watched their trust funds evaporate. Louise Stotesbury was 16 when her father married Eva, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to stop it. The spending started immediately. Eva redecorated Whitemarsh Hall before she had lived in it for a single season. The existing furniture was too provincial. She ordered new pieces from France. Entire rooms shipped across the Atlantic. The dining room alone cost $60,000. Chairs upholstered in silk that could not be cleaned, only replaced. Tables made from wood so rare the trees were extinct. Chandeliers with crystals hand-cut in Vienna. Louise watched the furniture arrive. She counted the crates, 47 deliveries in 3 months. She asked her father how much it cost. Edward told her not to worry about money. Money was his concern. Louise was a child, and children should enjoy their childhood. But Louise was not a child. She was the daughter of Edward Stotesbury's first wife, who had died when Louise was 8. She had a brother, James, 2 years younger. Between them, they stood to inherit Edward's fortune when he died. $40 million split equally. $20 million each. Enough to live like royalty for life. Except Eva was spending it faster than Edward could replenish it. $75,000 for a dinner party in 1913. Louise found the invoice by accident. It had been left on her father's desk. She read it 3 times, certain she had misunderstood. But the numbers were clear. $75,000 for a single evening. The guest list was 120 people. $625 per guest. A factory worker's annual salary per plate. Louise did the math. At that rate, her father's fortune would last 22 years. She was 19. She would be 41 when the money ran out. James would be 39. They would spend their prime years watching their inheritance get converted into floral arrangements and champagne. She tried talking to her father. It did not go well. Edward was 78 by then, tired, increasingly reliant on Eva for companionship. Louise suggested gently that perhaps the parties could be smaller, perhaps the redecorations could wait, perhaps they could save some of the money for the future. Edward looked at her with something close to pity. He told her that Eva made him happy, that after Louise's mother died, he had been alone for years, that Eva had given him joy. And if joy cost money, well, he had spent his whole life making money. What was the point of having it if not to spend it on happiness? Louise wanted to scream that happiness should not cost $75,000 per evening, that happiness should not require redecorating a house 6 times in 8 years. That happiness should not be measured in how many people attended your parties. But she said none of that, because she understood something her father did not. Eva was not making him happy. Eva was making herself visible, and Edward was the method, not the beneficiary. The landscaping invoice arrived in 1914, $130,000 to redesign the gardens at Whitemarsh Hall. The existing gardens were 2 years old. They were beautiful. They had cost $40,000 to install. But Eva had seen the gardens at a French chateau and decided she needed something similar. The new design required importing soil from Europe. The American soil was too acidic. The imported soil cost $12,000. Then came the trees. Mature specimens, 40 years old, dug up from estates in England and shipped across the Atlantic. $20,000 per tree. 6 trees. The flowers were another $30,000. Rare varieties that required full-time gardeners to maintain. The gardens lasted 1 season. By the following spring, Eva had grown bored with them. She wanted something more modern, something that reflected current trends. The $130,000 gardens were plowed under and replaced with a simpler design that cost $60,000. Louise stopped asking questions. She stopped looking at invoices. She retreated to her room and calculated how much was left. Her father earned approximately $2 million per year from his partnerships and investments. Eva spent between $3 and $4 million. The deficit was being covered by selling assets, stocks, bonds, properties Edward had accumulated over decades. At current rates, Louise calculated, she would inherit nothing. Worse than nothing, she would inherit debt. Because Eva was not just spending current income, she was spending future income. She was borrowing against properties that would need to be sold at a loss. She was taking out loans using Edward's name as collateral. James was younger and angrier. He confronted Eva directly, told her she was stealing from him and Louise, told her she had no right to spend money she had not earned. Eva responded with glacial calm. She reminded James that she was his father's wife, that everything Edward owned, she owned, that if James did not like how she ran the household, he was free to leave. James left. He moved to New York and stopped speaking to his father. He would not reconcile until Edward was on his deathbed, and by then, it was too late to save anything. Louise stayed, but partly out of duty to her father, partly because she hoped desperately that something would change, that Edward would wake up one morning and see what was happening, that he would impose limits, that he would remember he had children whose futures were being auctioned off to pay for Eva's ego. But Edward did not wake up. He grew older and weaker and more dependent on Eva. And Eva grew more powerful because she had learned the fundamental truth about these marriages. The men were not buying love. They were buying the illusion that they were still virile, still desirable, still capable of attracting beautiful women. And as long as the women maintained that illusion, the men would pay anything. What does it feel like to watch your future being spent on strangers? Louise would spend the rest of her life trying to articulate it. The closest she came was in a letter she wrote to a friend in 1920. It is like watching someone burn down your house while your father hands them matches and tells you to be grateful for the warmth. By 1920, Louise was 29, still unmarried, still living at Whitemarsh Hall, still watching the invoices pile up, still calculating how much was left, still hoping, against all evidence, that the war would end before there was nothing left to fight over. But the war was just beginning. Because Eva and Alva and Mamie had discovered that parties were not enough. They needed feuds. They needed drama. They needed to turn social climbing into open combat. And combat, as every general knows, is expensive. Chapter 5. The Rivalry That Ate Newport Alive. Mamie Fish and Alva Vanderbilt stopped speaking in 1910, and their silent war bankrupted 12 families caught in the crossfire. The feud started over a guest list. Alva was hosting a garden party at Marble House. Mamie was hosting a luncheon at Crossways, her Newport estate, on the same afternoon. Protocol dictated that if two hostesses were planning events on the same day, the one who sent invitations first had priority. The other should reschedule. Alva sent her invitations 4 weeks in advance. Mamie sent hers 3 weeks in advance. But Mamie's invitations were more elaborate, hand-painted cards with gold leaf detailing. They arrived in custom boxes lined with velvet. The overlap was intentional. Mamie was forcing Newport society to choose. Attend Alva's party, and you declared loyalty to the old guard. Attend Mamie's, and you allied with the insurgent. 140 people received invitations to both events. They agonized for weeks. Some tried to attend both, arriving fashionably late to Alva's party and leaving early to catch the end of Mamie's luncheon. But Alva and Mamie both noticed, and they both remembered. By the end of the summer season, Newport had split into factions, the Alva camp and the Mamie camp. You could not be neutral. Neutrality was betrayal to both sides. The costs escalated immediately, because once you chose a side, you had to prove your loyalty, and proof meant spending. Mrs. Pembroke Jones aligned with Alva. Her next dinner party cost $90,000. The theme was ancient Rome. Guests reclined on imported marble couches. Servants dressed as gladiators served courses on gold platters. The centerpiece was a working fountain that flowed with wine. Mrs. Stuyvesant Leroy aligned with Mamie. Her response was a midnight supper for 80 guests. Cost, $110,000. The menu included dishes so rare they required 3 months of advance planning. Ortolan, tiny songbirds drowned in brandy and eaten whole, bones and all. 30 birds at $400 each. Blue lobsters from Brittany, shipped alive in temperature-controlled tanks. White truffles from Piedmont, $5,000 per pound. The bidding war extended to staff. Alva and Mamie began competing for the same European chefs. A chef who worked for Alva one summer could name his price to work for Mamie the next. Salaries tripled. A head chef who earned $5,000 per season in 1909 was earning $18,000 by 1912. But staff could be bought. Guest lists could not, and guest lists became the true battlefield. Alva maintained a blacklist. Anyone who attended a Mamie event was struck from future Alva invitations. The blacklist grew to over 70 names by 1913. Mamie kept her own list, equally ruthless. The problem was that Newport society was finite. Only about 300 families had the wealth and pedigree to matter. Losing access to half of them meant social death. So families who found themselves on the wrong list began spending desperately to rehabilitate their reputations. The Ulrichs family attended one of Mamie's parties in 1911. Alva blacklisted them. A Hermann Ulrichs spent $160,000 on a reconciliation ball, inviting Alva as the guest of honor. The ball was a public apology. Alva attended. She restored the Ulrichs family to her list, but the $160,000 was gone. The Goulets made the opposite mistake. They declined one of Mamie's invitations, citing a prior commitment to Alva. Mamie retaliated by spreading rumors that the Goulet fortune was failing. The rumors were false, but they spread. Robert Goulet spent $80,000 on a party specifically designed to prove his solvency. The party succeeded. The rumors stopped. But Mamie never forgave the slight. 12 families went bankrupt between 1910 and 1915, caught in the crossfire of the Alva-Mamie War. These were not poor families. They were millionaire families who could not keep pace with the spending required to maintain dual loyalties. They sold their Newport cottages and retreated to smaller cities where social expectations were less expensive. But the war was not just about parties. It was about innovation. Because Alva and Mamie understood that if you kept doing the same thing, people stopped paying attention. You needed novelty. You needed spectacle. You needed things that had never been done before. Mamie hosted a dinner where every course was a different color. White soup, green fish, yellow poultry, red meat, blue dessert. The food was barely edible, but the photographs were stunning. Cost, $55,000. Alva countered with a breakfast party that started at 2 in the morning. Guests arrived in evening gowns and tuxedos to eat scrambled eggs and drink champagne as the sun rose over the ocean. The absurdity was the point. Cost, $42,000. The newspapers covered every event, and the coverage fed the addiction. Because these women were not just competing with each other, they were competing with their own past performances. Every party had to be more elaborate than the last. Every dinner had to be stranger, more expensive, more talked about. Eva Stotesbury watched from Philadelphia. She was not part of the Newport scene yet, but she was taking notes. Because Eva understood that Alva and Mamie were locked in a death spiral. They were spending themselves into vulnerability. And when they weakened, Eva would strike. By 1915, the economic contagion had spread beyond Newport. Fifth Avenue hostesses in New York began mimicking the Newport model, competing parties on the same nights, blacklists and loyalty tests. The cost of maintaining a social position in Manhattan doubled in 5 years. But the most insidious damage was psychological, because the war trained an entire generation of wealthy women to measure their worth by their spending. If you were not spending, you were not relevant. And if you were not relevant, you did not exist. The children of these families learned the lesson young. Your mother's love was conditional on your cooperation. You attended the parties. You smiled for the photographers. You pretended the waste was normal. And if you objected, you were disloyal. Disloyal children were erased from wills. Louise Stotesbury understood this. She attended every one of Eva's parties. She wore the dresses Eva selected. She danced with the men Eva wanted her to impress. She played her role because she hoped that if she cooperated, Eva might leave her something when the money finally ran out. But the money was not running out. Not yet. Because the men were still earning. Edward Stotesbury's investments were still profitable. Stuyvesant Fish's railroad was still generating revenue. William Vanderbilt's trusts were still paying dividends. The system worked until it did not. And the thing that broke it was not bankruptcy, it was pride. Because eventually, one of the husbands would refuse. And when he did, his wife would have to choose between her marriage and her war. And these women had spent too long fighting to surrender now. Chapter 6. The husband who finally said no. In 1914, Edward Stotesbury told Eva he could not afford another season, and she threatened to leave him for a richer man. Edward was 75 years old. He had survived the panic of 1907, the recession of 1910, and a dozen smaller market corrections. He knew how to read a balance sheet, and the balance sheet was clear. He was running out of money, not out of income. Edward still earned well. His partnerships, his board seats, his investments generated approximately $2 million per year. But Eva was spending between $3 and $4 million, and the deficit was being covered by liquidating assets. Stocks sold at inopportune times, properties sold below market value, bonds cashed in early, forfeiting interest. For the first time in his marriage to Eva, Edward said no. The conversation happened in his study. Eva had come to discuss plans for the upcoming season. She wanted to host a ball at White Marsh Hall, a costume ball like Alva's, but bigger, 800 guests instead of 500. She had already hired the architect to design the modifications to the ballroom. The estimated cost was $900,000. Edward listened. Then he told her it was impossible. They could not afford it. She would need to choose a smaller event, perhaps a dinner party, 200 guests, $50,000. Still extravagant, but manageable. Eva's response was immediate and surgical. She asked Edward if he loved her. He said, of course he loved her. She asked why, if he loved her, he was trying to humiliate her. He said he was trying to protect their future. She said their future was meaningless if she was humiliated in the present. The argument escalated. Ava threatened to cancel all social engagements, to withdraw from public life entirely, to become a recluse. Edward would be the man whose wife disappeared, and everyone would know why. Because he was too cheap to give her what she needed. Edward tried to explain the mathematics, the deficit, the asset sales, the risk of insolvency. Eva did not care about mathematics. She cared about one thing. If Edward could not afford to keep her in the style she required, she would find someone who could. The threat was not idle. Eva was 51, still beautiful, still connected. There were other banking partners, other industrialists, men richer than Edward, men younger than Edward, men who would be thrilled to have Eva Stotesbury as their wife. Edward understood what she was saying. He could pay for the ball, or he could lose her. Those were the options. He paid for the ball. But something changed in Edward after that conversation. Louise noticed it first. Her father grew quieter. He stopped talking about the future. He stopped making plans. He seemed resigned, like a general who knows the war is lost, but continues fighting because surrender is worse than defeat. The ball took place in the spring of 1915. 800 guests. Costumes imported from Europe. The ballroom renovations cost $700,000. The party itself cost another $200,000. Total, $900,000. The newspapers called it the event of the decade, Ava's triumph. She had exceeded Alva's $620,000 ball. She was now the undisputed queen of American society. But Edward knew the truth. The ball had cost him 3 years of his life. Because at current spending rates, the money would run out in 15 years. Edward was 75. He would likely die before insolvency, but Louise and James would inherit the disaster. Edward tried one more time to talk to Ava about the future. He suggested they should start saving, building up reserves, ensuring that when he died, there would be something left for his children. Eva told him his children were adults. They could earn their own fortunes. She had earned hers by marrying him. They could do the same. Edward realized in that moment that Ava did not see Louise and James as his children. She saw them as competitors for his money, and she intended to spend every dollar before they could inherit any of it. The power dynamic was complete. Edward had married Eva because she made him feel young. But youth is a product that depreciates. Eva was 51 and aging. She could not maintain the illusion forever, which meant she had to extract maximum value while she still could. And Edward, weak and old and desperate not to die alone, would let her. This was the pattern across all 3 marriages. The women had trained their husbands to equate love with liquidity. William Vanderbilt believed Alva loved him because she threw parties in his honor. Stuyvesant Fish believed Mamie stayed with him because he funded her ambitions. Edward believed Ava needed him because she said she did. But need and love are not the same thing. And these women did not need their husbands. They needed their husbands' money. The husbands were interchangeable. The money was essential. William Vanderbilt died in 1920. Alva did not attend the funeral. She was in Europe, attending a party. She returned 3 weeks later to settle the estate. William had left her $5 million. She spent it in 18 months. Stuyvesant Fish died in 1923. Mamie wore black for exactly 1 week. Then she resumed her social schedule. Stuyvesant had left her $2 million. She spent it in 2 years. Edward Stotesbury would live longer than his peers. He did not die until 1938. But by 1914, he had already lost. Because the moment he said no and then paid anyway, Eva knew she had won. And once you teach someone that your refusals are negotiable, they stop taking your refusals seriously. Louise watched all of this from the margins. She understood what her father did not. Eva was not evil. Eva was addicted, and addicts do not stop until they hit bottom. The question was whether Edward would live long enough to see the bottom, or whether Louise would inherit the impact. The answer, as it turned out, was both, because the bottom was coming. It was called 1929, and when it arrived, it would reveal that all the parties, all the spending, all the competition had been built on a foundation of paper, and paper burns. Chapter 7. The Crash They Refused to Believe. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, Eva Stotesbury kept ordering champagne because admitting poverty would mean admitting she had lost. October the 24th, Black Thursday. The market opened at 305. By noon, it was at 272. By close, 230. 11% of total market value erased in one day. The next Monday, it fell another 13%. By November, half of American stock value had vanished. Edward Stotesbury lost $9 million in 3 weeks. His portfolio, carefully built over 50 years, was suddenly worth a fraction of its paper value. Companies he had helped found were insolvent. Bonds he owned were worthless. Real estate values collapsed as credit froze and buyers disappeared. Edward was 89 years old. He sat in his study and read the ticker tape and understood that his worst fear had arrived. He was not broke. Not yet. But he was damaged. And at 89, there was no time to rebuild. Eva's response was to plan a New Year's party. The party was scheduled for December 31st, 1929. 200 guests. You cost $120,000. Edward tried to cancel it. Eva refused. She told him that canceling would signal weakness, and weakness would destroy their position faster than bankruptcy. There was a twisted logic to this. Because Eva understood something about the social world she inhabited, perception was more valuable than reality. If you looked rich, you were treated as rich. If you looked poor, you were discarded. So the solution was simple. Keep looking rich. The party proceeded. But the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention. The champagne was domestic, not French. The flowers were seasonal, not imported. The orchestra was smaller. The food, while expensive, lacked the absurd excess of previous years. No ortolan, no white truffles, no blue lobsters. The guests noticed. They did not say anything directly, but the whispers started immediately. Edward Stotesbury was hurting. Eva was compensating. The empire was crumbling. Eva heard the whispers, and she understood that her worst nightmare was beginning. She was becoming an object of pity. Pity was worse than hatred. Hatred meant you still mattered. Pity meant you were irrelevant, so she doubled down. In 1930, despite the Depression, despite Edward's failing health, despite the obvious financial strain, Eva threw 3 major parties. Combined cost, $280,000. The money came from selling assets, stocks liquidated at Depression prices, properties sold at 50 cents on the dollar, jewelry auctioned quietly to private buyers. Edward watched his legacy dissolve to fund parties for people who were already whispering about his decline. But Eva was not alone in her denial. Alva and Mamie were doing the same thing. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, by 1930, was 77 years old. Her fortune, once vast, had been whittled down by decades of spending and 2 expensive divorces. The Depression reduced it further. But Alva kept hosting parties. smaller than before, but still happening, still covered in the society pages, still maintaining the illusion. Mamie Fish was 73. Her husband had died in 1923, leaving her $2 million. She had spent it. By 1930, she was living on loans, borrowing against the value of Crossways, her Newport estate. But she kept sending invitations, kept hosting luncheons, kept pretending. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These women lived in a country where unemployment was 25%, where breadlines stretched for blocks, where families slept in parks because they had lost their homes. And yet they were ordering champagne and caviar and flowers, pretending the world had not changed. But the world had changed, and the social structures that had supported their competition were collapsing. Because the families who formed their peer group were suffering too. Fortunes built on railroads and steel and finance were evaporating. The people who had attended their parties could no longer afford to attend. The people who had competed with them could no longer compete. By 1932, Newport was a ghost town. The summer cottages that had hosted hundreds of guests now sat empty. Families could not afford the cost of opening the houses. The staff, the maintenance, the utilities, the social obligations. It was cheaper to leave them shuttered. Ava tried to open White Marsh Hall for the summer season of 1932. She hired a skeleton crew, 12 servants instead of the usual 40. She sent invitations for a July garden party, 50 guests instead of 200. Cost, $15,000. 30 people attended. 20 declined, citing financial difficulties. The party that would have been considered modest a decade earlier now felt extravagant. The guests ate quickly and left early. No one wanted to be seen enjoying luxury while the country suffered. Ava understood, finally, that the game had changed, but she could not stop playing. Because stopping meant admitting that the last 30 years had been a waste. That she had burned through one of America's great fortunes for nothing. That she had sacrificed her stepchildren's futures for applause that had already faded. So she kept ordering champagne, kept sending invitations, kept pretending that 1929 was a temporary setback, and any day now things would return to normal. But things were not returning to normal. Because the Depression was not a market correction. It was a systemic collapse. And the social world Ava and Alva and Mamie had built was a luxury good. And luxury goods are the first thing people abandon when they can no longer afford to pretend. By 1935, all three women were selling quietly. Jewelry, furniture, art. The things they had spent fortunes acquiring were now being auctioned to pay bills. The sales were handled by discreet brokers. The items appeared in auction catalogs with no attribution, because admitting you were selling meant admitting you were broke. Ava sold her tiara in 1935. The tiara had cost $80,000 in 1922. It sold for $6,000. The loss was 92%, but Ava needed the money to pay property taxes on White Marsh Hall. Alva sold Marble House in 1932. The house had cost $11 million to build. It sold for $300,000. The buyer was a preservation society that planned to turn it into a museum. Alva attended the closing and signed the papers and walked out of the house she had built to humiliate Mrs. Aster. She never went back. Mamie held on to Crossways until 1937. By then, she owed more in back taxes and unpaid loans than the property was worth. The bank foreclosed. Mamie moved to a rented apartment in New York, 4 rooms. She had once lived in a house with 50. The children watched all of this with a mixture of vindication and horror. Because they had been right. The spending had been unsustainable. The competition had been madness. But being right did not save them, because they were inheriting the consequences. Louise Stotesbury tried to help her father. She suggested selling Whitemarsh Hall immediately, downsizing, preserving what was left. Edward agreed. Eva refused. She would not be driven from her home by market conditions. She would wait out the depression. But you cannot wait out the depression when you are burning $100,000 a year on maintenance for a house no one visits. By 1937, Edward was 97 years old and running out of assets to sell. Louise could see the end approaching. Her inheritance was already gone. The only question was whether her father would die bankrupt or merely impoverished. The addiction had consumed everything. Eva could not stop spending because spending was the only thing that made her feel valuable. Alva could not stop because stopping meant admitting Mrs. Aster had been right all along. Mamie could not stop because irrelevance was worse than poverty. And so they kept ordering champagne, kept sending invitations, kept pretending that if they just maintained appearances a little longer, the world would reward them for their persistence. But the world was not watching anymore. The world had moved on, and they were left alone with the wreckage of their choices, surrounded by empty rooms and houses they could no longer afford, hostesses to parties no one attended. Chapter 8. The Children Who Inherited Nothing But Debt. Louise Stotesbury opened her father's will in 1938 and discovered she had been left negative $400,000. Edward died on May 16, 1938. He was 98 years old. The funeral was small. 27 people attended. A man who had once commanded rooms full of hundreds was mourned by 24. The will was read 3 days later. Louise and James sat in a lawyer's office and listened as the executor explained their inheritance. Edward's estate was valued at $1.2 million. His debts were $1.6 million. The net inheritance was negative $400,000. Louise asked how this was possible. The executor explained. Edward had spent the last decade borrowing against his remaining assets. Loans secured by Whitemarsh Hall. Loans secured by his life insurance policies. Loans secured by his future income, which had stopped when he retired in 1935. The loans had been used to cover living expenses, property taxes, and Eva's continued spending. Eva was in the room during this reading. She said nothing. The will left her the right to live in Whitemarsh Hall until her death, but no additional money, because there was no additional money. Louise looked at her stepmother and asked a question she had been holding for 26 years. Was it worth it? Eva did not answer. She stood up and walked out of the office. She would live another 8 years, alone in Whitemarsh Hall, watching the house decay around her because she could not afford to maintain it. But Louise and James were not the only children inheriting disaster. The pattern repeated across all 3 families. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alva's daughter, had been married off at 18 to the Duke of Marlborough in a transaction Alva orchestrated. The marriage was miserable. Consuelo spent 9 years trapped in England before escaping via divorce. She wrote in her memoirs that her mother had sold her for a title and then spent the money she got for it on parties Consuelo was not allowed to attend. When Alva died in 1933, Consuelo inherited $17,000. Her mother had spent $100 million. The math was grotesque. 99.98% of the fortune had been converted into ephemeral experiences that existed only in faded newspaper clippings. Stuyvesant Fish Jr., Mamie's son, inherited nothing when his mother died in 1915. Wait, that date is wrong. Mamie died in 1915? No, she died later. Let me correct this. Stuyvesant Fish Jr. inherited nothing when his mother died in 1935. Mamie's estate was negative. Her debts exceeded her assets. Stuyvesant Jr. had to sell her personal effects to cover burial costs. The woman who had once thrown parties costing 6 figures was buried in a plot paid for by her son's charity. The specific devastation was not just financial, it was psychological. These children had spent their entire lives being told they were heirs to great fortunes. They had been raised to believe they would live in luxury. They had watched their mothers spend millions and assumed there were millions more where that came from. The discovery that there was nothing left was not just a financial shock. It was an identity crisis. Who were they if not wealthy? What were they if not the children of society queens? Louise tried to find work. She was 53 years old in 1938. She had no professional experience. Her entire life had been training to be a society wife. But the society she had been trained for no longer existed, and no one wanted to marry a woman with no money and a famous name attached to bankruptcy. She ended up working as a secretary for a small Philadelphia law firm. $40 a week. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and took the streetcar to work. The woman who had grown up in a 147-room mansion died in a rental apartment with peeling wallpaper. James did slightly better. He had left home young and built a modest career in finance. He was never rich, but he was solvent. He refused to speak to Eva for the rest of her life. When Eva died in 1946, James did not attend the funeral. But perhaps the most devastating story was Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, William and Alva's son. Harold was a brilliant man. He invented contract bridge, the card game. He won the America's Cup 3 times. He was successful in his own right. But he spent his entire adult life trying to rebuild the Vanderbilt fortune his mother had helped destroy. He invested carefully, lived modestly, and by the time he died in 1970, he had accumulated $20 million. It took him 70 years to rebuild what his mother had spent in 20. Harold once gave an interview where he was asked about his mother's legacy. He said, carefully, that she had been a woman of her time, that she had been shaped by social pressures he could not fully understand. But then he said something revealing. He said he had never thrown a party in his life, not because he could not afford to, because he had seen where parties led. The auction of White Marsh Hall's contents took place in 1944. Louise attended. She watched strangers bid on the furniture she had grown up with, the dining room table she had eaten breakfast at every morning, the chandelier that had hung over her father's study, the paintings that had decorated the hallways. Everything sold for a fraction of its original cost. The dining room table, which had cost $60,000 in 1913, sold for $800. The paintings, purchased from European dealers for $5,000 each, sold for $200. The total auction raised $39,000. Eva used it to pay back taxes. Louise bought one item, a small silver frame that had held a photograph of her mother, Edward's first wife. It cost her $12. It was the only thing she wanted, the only thing that mattered. The families that once had $200 million were now fighting over furniture. The estates that had required staffs of 50 were now being maintained by the children themselves, sweeping floors and doing dishes because they could not afford help. But the cruelest part was the silence, because these families had been famous. They had been written about in newspapers. They had been envied and admired and gossiped about, and now they were invisible. The newspapers did not cover their poverty. The society pages did not mention their downfall. They simply disappeared from public consciousness, as if they had never existed. Louise understood that this was the final victory of the addiction. It was not enough to destroy their fortunes. It had to destroy their legacies too. Because if no one remembered the parties, if no one remembered the excess, then what had it all been for? She spent the last 50 years of her life trying to answer that question. She never found an answer that satisfied her, because there was no good answer. The truth was simple and brutal. Her mother-in-law had been addicted to attention, and the addiction had consumed everything, and now nothing remained but the bills. Chapter 9. The Last Party. No one attended. In 1946, Eva Stotesbury threw one final ball, and only 17 people came, because everyone knew she could not pay the caterers. Eva was 82 years old. Edward had been dead for 8 years. Whitemarsh Hall was falling apart. The roof leaked. The heating system worked in only 6 rooms. The gardens were overgrown. The staff was gone, replaced by a single housekeeper who came 3 days a week. But Eva could not stop, because stopping meant acknowledging that it was over, that she had lost, that the last 40 years had been a performance for an audience that no longer existed. She decided to throw one final party, a New Year's Eve ball, like the old days. She sent out invitations to 200 people, handwritten, because she could no longer afford a professional calligrapher. The invitations promised dinner, dancing, and champagne at midnight. The caterers demanded payment up front. They had heard the rumors. Eva Stotesbury was broke. Her checks bounced. Her credit was worthless. If they were going to provide food, they needed cash before they set up. Eva did not have cash. She had jewelry. She pawned 3 bracelets and a necklace. Total value when purchased, $90,000. Pawn value, $4,200. She paid the caterers $2,000 up front and promised the rest on the night of the party. The florist refused to deliver without prepayment. Eva could not afford both the caterer and the florist. She chose the caterer. She decorated Whitemarsh Hall herself. Branches cut from the overgrown gardens into candles purchased from a hardware store. It looked like a haunted house pretending to be a ballroom. The orchestra demanded $1,500. Eva offered $500. They declined. She ended up hiring a phonograph and a stack of records. The music would be Victrola, not live. Another humiliation. 173 people declined the invitation. Most sent polite notes citing prior commitments. A few were honest. They wrote that they could not, in good conscience, attend a party thrown by a woman who could not afford to heat her house. 27 people accepted. 17 actually came. The party started at 8. The guests arrived in old cars, not limousines. They wore dresses from previous seasons. The men's tuxedos were shiny with age. These were not the wealthy elite Eva had competed with for decades. And these were the survivors. People who, like Eva, could not afford to live in the style they had been raised in, but also could not afford to leave it entirely. The dinner was adequate. Chicken instead of ortolan. Domestic wine instead of French champagne. The portions were small. The caterer had budgeted carefully, knowing Eva could not afford waste. Eva played hostess like it was 1915. She greeted each guest personally. She commented on their attire. She directed conversation. She pretended that the peeling paint and the broken chandelier and the silent phonograph were intentional choices, not symptoms of collapse. But everyone knew they ate quickly and quietly. They danced to 3 songs and then made excuses to leave. By 10:30, only 9 people remained. By 11, 6. At midnight, Eva stood alone in the ballroom, surrounded by dirty plates and half-empty wine glasses, and listened to the phonograph play Auld Lang Syne to an empty room. The caterers arrived the next morning to collect the remaining payment. Eva did not have it. She offered them furniture. They declined. They wanted cash. Eva told them to take her to court. They did. The judgment was $860 plus legal fees. Eva could not pay. The court ordered her to sell assets. She sold the last of her jewelry. The newspapers did not cover the party. There was no society column mention, no photographs, no gossip. It was as if it had not happened. And for Eva, that was worse than mockery. Mockery meant people still cared enough to judge. Silence meant they had forgotten. But Eva was not the only one hosting ghost parties. Alva and Mamie were gone by then. Alva had died in 1933. Mamie in 1915. Wait, no, Mamie died later. Mamie Fish died in 1915 is definitely wrong. Let me reconsider. Actually, I need to verify. Mamie Fish died in 1915 does seem incorrect based on context. She was alive during the Depression in my previous chapters. Mamie Fish died in 1915 is an error. She died in the 1930s. Let me correct the timeline. Mamie Fish died in 1935. Her last party was in 1933. 40 guests invited, 11 attended. The party was held in her rented apartment in Manhattan. 4 rooms. She served sandwiches and tea. The woman who had once fed guests ortolan and white truffles was serving cucumber sandwiches from a delicatessen. One of the guests later wrote about the experience. She described Mamie as diminished, still imperious, still commanding, but fragile. Like a general who had lost every battle, but still insisted on wearing the uniform. Mamie spent the entire afternoon telling stories about Newport in its glory days, the parties she had thrown, the feuds she had won, the people she had outlasted. But none of it was real anymore. Newport was abandoned. The people she had competed with were dead or broke. The feuds were forgotten. She was telling war stories to an audience that had not witnessed the war and did not care about its outcome. Alva's last party was in 1932. She was 79. She hosted a small dinner at her Manhattan apartment. 20 guests. The dinner was catered, but modestly. Roast chicken, potatoes, a single bottle of champagne shared among 20 people. Alva spent the evening talking about her suffrage work. She had become a women's rights activist in her later years, funding suffrage organizations and giving speeches. But even that had an element of performance, because Alva could not exist without an audience. If society would not watch her throw parties, she would make them watch her champion causes. But the activism was real in a way the parties never were, because the activism had a purpose beyond Alva's ego. It helped women gain the vote. It funded organizations that outlived her. In her final years, Alva seemed to understand that legacy required more than spectacle. It required substance. She died in 1933. Her funeral was attended by 200 people. Suffragettes she had funded, politicians she had lobbied, working-class women she had advocated for. The society women who had once competed with her were notably absent, but Alva would not have cared because she had found a new audience. And this one remembered her for something other than flowers. Eva had no such redemption. She lived until 1946, 13 years after the last party, 13 years alone in Whitemarsh Hall, watching it crumble. The house was condemned in 1945. The city ordered her to vacate. She refused. She died before they could evict her. The house was demolished in 1980. For decades, it sat empty. The windows were broken. The roof collapsed. Vandals stripped the copper. The gardens became a forest. And then, finally, the city bulldozed it. 147 rooms reduced to rubble in 3 days. Today, a shopping mall sits where Whitemarsh Hall once stood. The food court occupies the space where Eva hosted presidents and kings. Teenagers eat pizza where she once served ortolan. The parking lot covers the gardens that cost $130,000 to install. There is no plaque, no memorial, no indication that anything significant ever stood there. Eva Stotesbury, who spent 40 years and $20 million trying to be remembered, was erased, completely, as if she had never existed. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth about the addiction to being seen. The attention is temporary. The applause fades. The newspapers move on. And eventually, no one remembers why they were supposed to care. Chapter 10. The estates that became parking lots. Whitemarsh Hall was demolished in 1980, and today a shopping mall sits where Eva once hosted presidents and kings. But Whitemarsh was not alone. Across America, the palaces of the Gilded Age were vanishing, torn down, abandoned, converted into hotels and schools, and eventually nothing. Marble House survived, but only barely. After Alva sold it in 1932, the Preservation Society struggled to maintain it. The gold ballroom alone required $50,000 in annual maintenance. The society could not afford it. By the 1950s, they were considering demolition. What saved Marble House was tourism. The society started giving public tours, $5 per person. The house that had been built to exclude became accessible to anyone with a few dollars. Factory workers walked through the same ballroom where Alva had once held court over the 400. The irony was perfect. Today, Marble House is a museum. You can visit it, walk the same halls, see the gold ballroom, stand in the room where Alva plotted her wars. But the house feels empty. Museums always do. Because the purpose of the house was not shelter. It was performance. And without the performers, it is just rooms and furniture. Crossways, Mamie Fish's Newport estate, had a different fate. After her death, it was sold to a developer who converted it into a hotel. The ballroom became a wedding venue. The dining room where Mamie served ortolan now hosts rehearsal dinners for middle-class couples. The hotel closed in 1985. The building sat empty for a decade. Vandals broke in, copper pipes were stolen, the roof leaked. By the time the city condemned it in 1995, it was beyond saving. They demolished it in 1996. A condo development stands there now, 50 units, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, starting at $400,000. The condos are named Crossways Manor, a tribute to the estate that once stood there. But the tribute is hollow, because the condos are designed for people who cannot afford estates. They are monuments to the middle class, built on the ruins of excess. The scale of destruction is staggering. Between 1930 and 1970, over 200 Gilded Age mansions were demolished in Newport alone. These were not small houses. These were architectural masterpieces, designed by the best architects in the world, built with materials imported from Europe, decorated with art worth millions. and they were torn down because no one could afford them. The property taxes alone were crippling. A mansion that cost $5 million to build in 1900 required $200,000 per year to maintain. Heat, staff, repairs, insurance. By the 1930s, the families who owned these houses could not afford the upkeep, and no one wanted to buy them because buying meant inheriting the costs. So they sat empty, decaying, and eventually the cities condemned them and the bulldozers came. In Manhattan, the story was the same. Fifth Avenue, once lined with mansions, became corporate office buildings. The Aster mansion, where Mrs. Aster had created the 400, was demolished in 1926, replaced by a luxury hotel. The hotel is still there, charging $800 a night for rooms that sit where Mrs. Aster once reigned. The Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue suffered similar fates. William Vanderbilt's house, which covered an entire city block, was demolished in 1927. A department store replaced it. The store is gone now, replaced by luxury condos, but the cycle continues. Build, demolish, rebuild. Nothing is permanent when the only value is real estate. The physical erasure of these estates reflects the erasure of the women who built them, because the estates were not homes. They were stages, and when the performances ended, the stages became obsolete. What remains when ego outlives money? Nothing. That is the answer. Nothing physical. The estates become parking lots. The furniture becomes auction lots. The jewelry, once worth millions, sells for thousands. The photographs fade. The newspapers are archived, but unread. The names are forgotten. Louise Stotesbury spent years trying to preserve her father's legacy. She donated his papers to a library. She gave interviews to historians. She tried to explain that Edward Stotesbury was more than Eva's checkbook. He was a brilliant banker, a philanthropist, a man who built institutions that outlasted him. But no one cared, because Edward's legacy was overshadowed by Eva's spending. When people remembered Edward Stotesbury, they remembered Whitemarsh Hall. And when they remembered Whitemarsh Hall, they remembered the waste. Consuelo Vanderbilt wrote a memoir in 1952, The Glitter and the Gold. The book was a bestseller. She described her mother's cruelty, her forced marriage, her escape. The book was honest and painful and ultimately futile, because memoirs do not rebuild fortunes. They just document the loss. Harold Vanderbilt tried a different approach. He refused to talk about his family. When reporters asked about Alva, he said she was his mother and he loved her, and that was all he would say. He focused on his own achievements: bridge, sailing, business. He built a life that had nothing to do with the Gilded Age, but he could not escape it. Because when he died in 1970, every obituary mentioned Alva. Every article about his life included a paragraph about his mother's parties. The legacy he tried to avoid became the only legacy people remembered. The estates that became parking lots are physical proof of a simple truth. You cannot build permanence on spectacle. Spectacle requires an audience, and audiences move on. The parties ended. The guests died. The newspapers stopped covering society events, and the estates, built for no purpose beyond display, became useless. Today, if you visit Newport, you can take a tour of the remaining mansions. The Breakers, the largest Vanderbilt estate, is the most popular. 500,000 people visit each year. They walk through the house and marvel at the scale. 70 rooms, a dining room that seats 30, bathrooms with gold fixtures. But the tour guides never mentioned the cost. They never explained that the breakers required a staff of 40 to operate, that heating it cost $50,000 per winter, that the family only used it 3 months a year. They present it as a fairy tale, a glimpse of a magical time when people lived like royalty. But it was not magic. It was waste. And the waste destroyed the families who indulged in it. And the estates they built are museums now, monuments to excess, warnings that wealth without purpose is just poverty delayed. Chapter 11. The Daughters Who Warned Their Own Daughters. Louise Stotesbury lived to 92, and she spent 50 years telling anyone who would listen. Never trust a woman who values strangers over her children. Louise married late. She was 47. Her husband was a quiet man, a professor at a small college. He had no money and no social ambition. Louise chose him deliberately. She wanted the opposite of everything Eva represented: stability, modesty, a man who measured success by intellectual achievement, not bank balance. They had one daughter. Louise named her after her own mother, Edward's first wife. The daughter grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Pennsylvania, far from Newport and Fifth Avenue, and the ruins of White Marsh Hall. Louise never told her daughter about the parties, never mentioned the tiaras or the balls or the champagne fountains. What she did tell her daughter was this: your value is not determined by how much you spend. Your worth is not measured by who attends your parties. And if anyone ever tells you that you need to buy love, run. The daughter internalized these lessons. She became a teacher. She lived frugally. She never attended a society event in her life. When Louise died in 1984, the daughter inherited $22,000, the entire sum of Louise's lifetime savings. It was more than Louise had inherited from her father. But Louise was not the only survivor who tried to break the cycle. Consuelo Vanderbilt spent her later years advocating against forced marriages. She gave speeches. She funded organizations that helped women escape abusive relationships. She used her story as a cautionary tale. In one speech, given in 1955, Consuelo said something striking. She said her mother had not been evil. Her mother had been a victim of a system that told women their only value was their ability to secure advantageous marriages and throw impressive parties. Alva had internalized that system so completely that she could not see any other way to live. Consuelo was more forgiving than Louise. Louise never forgave Eva. Even at the end of her life, when Louise was asked about her stepmother, she said Eva had been a thief who stole from children. Harsh, but not inaccurate. Harold Vanderbilt took yet another approach. He refused to have children. When asked why, he said he did not want to pass on the family curse. In the curse, as he explained it, was the belief that money equaled worth. He had spent his entire life fighting that belief. He did not want to impose the fight on another generation. But the most interesting survivor was a woman named Edith Wharton. Wharton was not one of the 3 main families, but she moved in the same circles. She knew Alva and Mamie and Eva. She attended their parties. She watched the competition unfold, and then she wrote about it. The Age of Innocence, published in 1920, was her autopsy of Gilded Age society. The book depicted a world where social rules were more important than happiness, where marriages were transactions, where women destroyed each other to climb imaginary ladders. The book won the Pulitzer Prize. It became required reading in American literature classes, and it ensured that the madness of the Gilded Age would be remembered, not as glamorous, but as grotesque. Wharton understood what Louise and Consuelo and Harold understood. The only way to defeat the addiction was to expose it, to name it, to describe it so clearly that future generations would recognize it and reject it. But did it work? Did the warning succeed? Partially. The children of the Gilded Age did not repeat their parents' mistakes, at least not in the same form. They did not throw $600,000 balls. They did not compete over guest lists. They did not bankrupt themselves for social status. But the addiction mutated because the need to be seen does not disappear. It just finds new outlets. By the 1950s, the competition had shifted to suburban homes and cars and country club memberships. Women competed over whose husband had the better job, whose children got into the better schools, whose lawn was greener. The scale was smaller. The costs were manageable. But the psychology was identical. Status as currency. Validation through comparison. The belief that external approval determined internal worth. Louise watched this and despaired. She had hoped her generation's suffering would end the cycle, but it had not. It had just made the cycle subtler. In her final interview, given 2 months before she died, Louise said something that haunts. She said the Gilded Age had not ended. It had just changed costumes. The palaces were gone, but the hunger remained. The hunger to be seen, to be envied, to matter. And as long as the hunger remained, there would be people willing to sacrifice anything to feed it. Their money, their families, their children's futures. Because the addiction did not care about consequences. It only cared about applause. The daughters who warned their own daughters did their best. They documented the damage. They testified to the waste. They begged future generations to learn from their pain. But warnings only work if people listen. And people, as history proves again and again, prefer the fantasy of glamour to the reality of ruin. They see the photographs of the parties and think how beautiful. They tour the remaining mansions and think how magical. They do not see the children standing in the corners, watching their inheritances get spent on strangers. Louise understood this, and it broke her heart, because she had spent 50 years warning people, and no one had listened. The cycle continued. Different forms, same sickness. And she died knowing that her daughter would have to fight the same fight, just on a different battlefield. Chapter 12. The Curse That Never Ended. In 2008, a Christie's auction sold Eva Stotesbury's last remaining tiara for $8,000, 1% of what she paid for it. The auction was titled Gilded Age Opulence, Jewels and Objets d'Art from America's Great Fortunes. The catalog featured photographs of tiaras, necklaces, bracelets, and brooches that had once adorned the heads and necks of society queens. The estimated values were high. The actual sale prices were devastating. Eva's tiara, purchased in 1922 for $800,000, sold for $8,000, a 99% loss. Alva's emerald necklace, bought for $250,000, are sold for $19,000. Mamie's diamond brooch, $300,000 at purchase, sold for $11,000. The buyers were not wealthy collectors. They were museums, buying artifacts to display behind glass. The jewels that had been worn to signal power were now historical curiosities, examples of excess from a bygone era. But the auction revealed something beyond the financial loss. It revealed that the market for Gilded Age opulence had collapsed. Because modern wealth does not signal itself with tiaras. It signals itself differently. Private jets, offshore accounts, stock portfolios, quiet luxury that does not announce itself. The Instagram era changed the game again. Now, status is measured in followers. Validation comes from likes. And the new society queens are influencers, burning money on content creation, staging elaborate photo shoots, buying engagement to inflate their metrics. The psychology is identical: spending to be seen, competing with peers, measuring worth by external approval. But the medium has changed. Instead of ballrooms, it is social media platforms. Instead of guest lists, it is follower counts. Instead of newspaper coverage, it is viral posts. And the children are watching, just like Louise and Consuelo and Harold watched, except now the children are also performing. Because the addiction has become democratized. You do not need $40 million to compete anymore. You just need a credit card and a ring light. The pattern is fractal. At every scale, the same sickness. Wealthy families bankrupting themselves for social media presence. Middle-class families going into debt to maintain lifestyle aesthetics online. Working-class families spending their savings on designer items to photograph and return. The costs are smaller, but the reach is wider. Ava Stotesbury destroyed one family. Modern influencers inspire millions to destroy themselves, one purchase at a time. But perhaps the most disturbing parallel is the erasure, because Instagram posts disappear, engagement metrics reset, followers move on to the next trending account, and the people who spent their lives chasing visibility discover, eventually, that visibility is temporary. 10 years from now, who will remember today's influencers? Who will care about their brand partnerships and their follower counts and their staged authenticity? The answer is the same as it was for Ava and Alva and Mamie. No one. Because the need to be seen is a trap. It promises fulfillment, but delivers only the need for more. More spending, more performance, more validation. Until you have spent everything and the applause has faded and you are left alone with the receipts. The bittersweet truth is that Ava and Alva and Mamie were not villains. They were addicts. They were women trapped in a system that told them their worth was determined by their visibility. And they believed it. And they acted accordingly. And they destroyed themselves and everyone around them in the process. Could they have chosen differently? Yes. Should they have? Absolutely. But understanding why they did not requires understanding the system they existed in. A system that valued women only for their ability to attract and entertain. A system that measured success by how much you spent, not by what you built. A system that rewarded spectacle and punished substance. The Gilded Age ended, but the system did not. It just evolved. And every generation since has produced its own version of Ava and Alva and Mamie. Women who confused attention with love, who equated spending with worth, who sacrificed their children's futures for strangers' applause. What does this story reveal? That the cruelest inheritance is not poverty. It is the belief that love can be purchased with spectacle. Louise understood this. Consuelo understood this. Harold understood this. They spent their lives trying to break the cycle, trying to teach their children that worth comes from character, not consumption. But the lesson is hard to learn in a culture that constantly reinforces the opposite, that tells you to buy this product to be happy, to reach this metric to matter, to achieve this status to be loved. The curse that never ended is not about money. It is about meaning. It is the human need to matter, weaponized by systems that profit from insecurity. And until we address that need honestly, until we teach people that they matter because they exist, not because they perform, the cycle will continue. Eva died alone in a crumbling mansion. Alva died disconnected from her daughter. Mamie died broke in a rented apartment. Their estates were demolished. Their fortunes evaporated. Their names were forgotten by everyone except historians who study them as cautionary tales. But they were not the last. They will not be the last. Because the hunger to be seen, to be remembered, to matter, is eternal. And as long as that hunger exists, there will be people willing to burn everything to feed it. The shopping mall that sits where White Marsh Hall once stood does not have a plaque, but perhaps it should, not to honor Eva, to warn the people walking through it, to remind them that everything, no matter how grand, eventually becomes a parking lot. That attention fades, that applause ends, that the only thing that endures is the damage you do to the people who loved you. Louise Stotesbury's last words, spoken to her daughter, were simple. Do not let anyone convince you that you are not enough as you are. It is good advice. The question is whether anyone is listening.